How would you like to live forever? Caro is a world-class neurosurgeon whose talents are confined to a secretive compound in the Cayman Islands. There, she implants research patients with a device capable of sending the subject's consciousness into a brand new, alternate universe of their choosing. And from their neural recordings, Caro can actually watch what they've experienced firsthand. But she's not convinced it's anything more than a heavily orchestrated hallucination. But let's back up a little. Ever since her broken family cut out Carolyn Soames Watkins just after high school, she's had a very difficult time getting through med school and eventually becoming a saver of lives. Now she works at a world-renowned hospital doing complicated procedures regularly, including the installation of deep brain stimulation implants to help people with epilepsy and other forms of seizures, as well as the careful removal of troublesome tumors. But one night at a party, her most esteemed of colleagues forces himself upon her. Would it have stopped with the groping? Or would it have continued on to something much worse if she hadn't aggressively gotten herself out of the situation? Not so much bent on retribution, but a worry that a woman might go through the same thing from the same man, she decides to speak up about it. But the only other person who saw this event occur, her friend, actually lies under oath and protects him. It's clear that this was orchestrated by the hospital because of how valuable of an employee this man is. He's otherwise seen as a hero and a saver of more lives than even Caro is. To avoid working in close proximity to a known predator, she decides to take her career elsewhere in the United States. But this is difficult due to her preference not to only be working with her hands, but to contribute to high-level research on the human brain. Either way, the sooner she can put this behind her, the better. But when social media gets their hand on this story, mobs are very quick to form, and they start to make her out as this purveyor of bogus claims against innocent men, some witch who's doing this either for monetary gain or just sick pleasure. This brewing, ignorant hatred ends up becoming so unmanageable that it destroys her career. No hospital wants to hire her. They want her expertise, but not the baggage that comes along with it. That's when she hears from her long-lost great-uncle, Samuel Watkins, the same Nobel laureate who years ago invented the cure to the common cold and of course made a massive fortune. An enigmatic recluse, Watkins has not spoken to any member of his family in many, many years. Carolyn barely even knows of his existence outside of his fame. And Watkins has only forsaken his reclusion to offer Caro employment at his secretive research facility on the small island of Cayman Brac. Caro's sister and most unconditional supporter, Ellen, is the one who pushes her to take this opportunity. However, Caro only takes it because she really wants to be able to keep supporting her sister. But when Caro arrives on the island paradise and enters the secure facility that on the inside is clearly discerned to have once been a hotel resort property, she finds her great-uncle Watkins on his deathbed. His pancreatic cancer has long since metastasized and he only has months to live. But still, Watkins has the energy to fervently push Caro to join the research team. She signs NDA after NDA before she's told anything about the project. At first, Julian, the handsome co-founder who once made a fortune in Silicon Valley's tech world, asks her in all his excess charm, "How would you like to live forever?" After several such frustratingly indirect explanations, Caro finally meets with the third and final co-founder, also physicist, Dr. Weigart, whose theory is responsible for this entire shenanigan. He explains to her just what is happening and why they are in such desperate need for a talented neurosurgeon. Weigart shares his theory of biocentrism, the belief that biology does not stem from the universe, but instead that reality functions in quite the opposite way. Our very senses and mind are responsible for collapsing a boundaryless, indistinct wave of quantum potential to construct the reality we find ourselves in, down to a very fundamental level. Time is subjective and does not actually exist. Neither does space, the cosmos, or all of its ornamentations. The grand cosmic past, from the Big Bang onwards, only exists because we perceive the universe at its present state, and therefore it requires a past that coincides with it. It is real, but only because we first perceived it as real. All the linearity in the universe is a conception that begins within our own minds, as it is the only way in which we can experience and navigate this infinity without labels. Its being depends on our seeing. We invent time only to suffer through it. And therefore, what we perceive of as the universe only exists because we are here to perceive it. Here's a quote by Dr. Weigart. Your brain isn't seeing anything out there because there isn't anything out there except a cloud of quantum information. Weigart backs this concept up with brief flashes of quantum physics, spanning from the double-slit experiment to entanglement between macrostructures. Caro understandably doesn't see this as a worthy excuse to perform brain surgery on patients who have no illness for no reason other than research. She's expected to install cables into people's brains to hook up to supercomputers built by Julian. To hopefully settle her qualms, Weigart explains a little bit farther. If biocentrism is an actual real aspect of the universe, that has some serious implications. By the simple act of observation, being an observer, we are creating the universe around us. And with each further observer, who may or may not have been created by the initial observer, the reality becomes more specific, grows in resolution. When enough people perceive a certain region to be a certain way, its very existence becomes more real. And Weigart is fully convinced that if they implant someone and feed the right information into the brain using Julian's code, they can trigger the subject to observe a different, programmable branch of reality, another quantum possibility. And once the observer sees this new potential within the multiverse, it becomes real, and thus all those who natively inhabit the newly formed universe will continue on without the initial observer once they are unplugged. A brand new multiverse, with a brand new past and a brand new future. Of course, Caro observes this to be vague, philosophical nonsense. But Julian, the handsome tech, reveals that he has already been implanted with the device, and he has gone to his own variety of multiverse on many occasions, and she can see the recordings. They show them to her. She watches his experience in another universe. She still thinks it's a hallucination. Caro has a lot to consider. It's soon clear that Watkins brought her here because, well, he's dying in a few months, and he wants to be implanted and brought to a multiverse where he's healthy and young so he can continue his work. He wants to live forever, just like Julian brought up. This is a way he can escape his terminal illness. Caro is just not convinced in the least, but she could really use this job, especially as it pays so phenomenally well. You see, Caro's sister Ellen matters more to her than anyone else. And despite her strength, Ellen has also had a very difficult life. Soon after the sisters were cut out of their parents' will, Ellen had a kid with a serial offender who is more than likely to spend more time in prison than anywhere else. Despite this, her daughter Kayla has developed really well, and that's only because of a huge amount of help from Caro. But Ellen also had a second daughter with the man named Angelica. She suffers from a rare neurological condition called Hempel's syndrome, a disease that causes progressive neurological degeneration, impacting her cognitive abilities, motor skills, and overall physical health. At 5, she can only scream and flail at the cruel world that she can't understand. Ellen dotes on Angelica with such thorough, unconditional love, keeping the girl as content as she could hope to be, vacuuming to remove her excrement, holding her close. Even at the age of 5, she's just as vulnerable as an infant. And Ellen wants to protect this little girl more than anything, and so does Caro. Of course, Ellen could never hope to sustain a job while caring for Angelica. It's a 24-hour task in itself. What little support she receives from social services only goes pitifully far. Whether or not she believes in what she's doing, Caro agrees to be a neurosurgeon on Cayman Brock. From here, Caro checks in with Ellen as often as she can in between her surgeries. Her sister has always been Caro's rock, and the woman's sunny demeanor is undaunting as she makes every sacrifice without a second thought for her 2 children, all with a smile on her face. But then, one night Caro gets a call from Ellen. She's never heard her sister shriek like this before. And the only words that come across the phone are, "My baby is dead. Angelica is dead." Again and again, the words strike like merciless thunder. And even weeks later, now placed in a mental hospital for her own safety, Ellen can only repeat the words, "Angelica is dead." This incredibly strong woman has been thoroughly broken by the loss of her beloved child. But in the weeks that Caro has spent on Cayman Brock, she's watched how her patients, including Dr. Weigart himself, have received real relief from at least believing that they've met with deceased loved ones in alternate universes where they're still alive. They can jack in and spend time with them in a universe that apparently, theoretically, continues on even after they pull back out of it. in their perspective, they've just saved this person. And so Carolyn has one caveat when she's asked to stay long-term in this job, when she's asked to stay another year, and that is for her sister Ellen to be implanted so that she can see little Angelica again. This novel is my favorite modern techno-thriller. The mysterious island compound setting we're introduced to in the first act is somewhat reminiscent of Crichton's Jurassic Park, but fresh and far more literary. And the character work is just the best. Much like Beggars in Spain, Kress's creative voice is still familiar in the best of ways, although this is a very different novel. She's honed her craft to such an extent, the first 200 pages flew by in nearly a single sitting. I really find Kress to be a master of pacing. There is just enough tension to push you forward from chapter to chapter, almost like if an audio engineer dialed in a perfect compressor. All the stuff about Ellen and her daughter Angelica is such this heartbreaking thread that just keeps you wanting to go farther. You want to see this thing resolve in some way. It serves as a wonderful push that at the same time makes Caro instantly likable. Also, Kress once said that Ursula K. Le Guin had a lucid prose. It's not trying to be smart, it just is smart. I think that Kress has achieved the same thing. A perfectly finessed balance of art and clarity. Man, what a great ending. You gotta read this book. Also, Kress has a great way of writing about feminist sensibilities without being excessive and respectful to just about every party. Here's a quote from an interview she did with Geek's Guide to the Galaxy here on YouTube. "I cannot see the patriarchy as having every single member of it an oppressor. That just hasn't been my experience." And it is with this refreshing nuance that Kress attacks each and every subject within this novel, as well as all of her work. But this is not just a book written by Kress. It was co-authored by Robert Lanza, who is the champion of the real-life theory of biocentrism, which is essentially identical to the ideology presented in this novel. Let's take another peek at this quote by Weigart from earlier. "Your brain isn't seeing anything out there because there isn't anything out there except a cloud of quantum information." The problem I initially had with this concept is predator and prey. In what nature would a prey adapt to create its own undoing? It goes against the very concepts of survival, evolution, adaptation, everything. If biology is the center of the universe, surely it would create a universe much more fit for itself. Of course, Kress called this, and she actually tackles this specific thing later in the novel. This quote also seeks to set aside such qualms. It's a quote by Dr. Weigart and concerns the double-slit experiment as well as many other things. When observers look, their consciousness becomes entangled with the system, part of the wave function, because everything is entangled with everything else. When you then look at that observer, you become part of the same decohered universe. So the observation coincides with the wave. Consciousness is not divorced from the mechanism of quanta. It is part of the wave, part of that mess of indivisible information, and therefore each participant in said wave is but one entity on the quantum level, predator or prey. Their very consciousness is part of the whole. And like I said before, the book seems to touch on this at later points. But I want my stance to be known. Biocentrism, or the idea that the universe begins at biology, begins at consciousness, actually isn't really Lanza's idea. In the 1930s, this was already debated. And in the 60s, Eugene Wigner, who once participated in a meeting with Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein that resulted in the Einstein-Szilard letter, was a strong proponent of consciousness before collapse, which is essentially biocentrism. But later in the 70s, Wigner was convinced otherwise and wanted to make it clear that his earlier claims should be seen as nothing more than solipsism, anthropocentrism. Another important thing to note is that biocentrism is actually impossible to prove wrong. You can't science it, therefore it's unscientific. So whether or not this is actually how reality operates, can we call it a theory, or is it really just a wistful concept? Don't let any of my critiques about Robert Lanza or biocentrism keep you from reading this book. I think that Nancy Kress has really knit a beautiful narrative here and used biocentrism as a badass sci-fi concept. It's actually got better character work than just about any hard sci-fi I've come across. I was also fortunate to attend a live Q&A session with Nancy Kress as part of the Writers of the Future contest. And I can tell you from experience that she is just as knowledgeable about the craft of writing as she is humbly brilliant. I learned several valuable lessons that I can apply to my upcoming works. As a sci-fi concept, I am a fan of biocentrism. For more on my journey as an author, as well as all things science fiction and fantasy, subscribe to Steller Reads. Also, if you like rock music, check out my band Sleep Cycle, link in the description.